Welcome to our Money Smart session. Today we're diving into a topic that affects each and every one of us, the cost of living. Imagine this, you've just landed your dream job offer, but it's in a city you've never lived in before. So, how do you know if that salary will cover all your expenses? Or maybe you're already living in a bustling metropolis and wondering why your savings aren't stacking up as you'd like. The cost of living holds the key to these mysteries. So buckle up and get ready to explore the ins and outs of the cost of living. This is Rachel Bustamante together with Miss Arjun Antonio and Miss Jasmine Lababit. Together we will unravel these mysteries of cost of living.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Arjun P. Antonio. So, before we proceed, let's have a quick recap of the previous discussion. In Chapter 3, we explored the nation's wealth, focusing on gross domestic product, or the GDP, which can be measured using two main approaches. The expenditure approach, which is based on consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports, and the income approach, which centered on total income, taxes, depreciation, and net foreign factor income. We also examined GDP's use in assessing economic performance, government policies, and cross-country comparisons. Key concepts such as real versus nominal GDP, GDP deflator, and GDP per capita were discussed, along with alternative measures of wealth like gross national product, GNP, net national product, NNP, national revenue, and Bhutan's gross national happiness, or the GNH. In Chapter 4, we will be introduced to the concept of the standard and cost of living as factors in economic growth and development. Specifically, this will help us discuss the concept of basket of goods and services of the country, determine the meaning of the standard of living in relation to economic development, understand the concept of consumer price index or the CPI on relation to inflation rate, differentiate economic situations such as hyperinflation, depression, recession, and stagflation. Then, define the cost of living allowance. Appreciate the cost of living in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or the ASEAN, to better understand the region's economic growth and development. Use the Lorenz curve and Gini coefficient in explaining the extent of inequality, a measure of the standard of living in a country. Explain the targets of the world in reducing inequality within and among member countries of the United Nations. Compare and contrast the cost of living in the ASEAN with the use of a worksheet, and understand the cost of living application in the eyes of government employee. This chapter is relevant because of the idea of inflation. One thing that is most applicable in our daily lives, regardless of where we are in the world. Say, for example, we had an increase in our salary by 3%, but the inflation rate at that time is 6%. In this case, we did not actually experience an increase in our salary, and in fact would have lost 3% purchasing power of our money. Inflation is the increase in prices in the economy, thereby decreasing the purchasing power of money on our hands. So inflation may be categorized into three: the demand pull inflation, which will be discussed by Rachel Bustamante; cost push inflation, which will be discussed by Jasmine Lababit; and monetary inflation, which I will discuss later. Now let's have Rachel to further explain the demand pull inflation.
Good day, everyone. This is Rachel Bustamante to discuss to you the demand pull inflation. Demand pull inflation occurs when the demand for goods and services in an economy exceeds the available supply, leading to an increase in prices. This phenomenon is often summarized as too many dollars chasing too few goods. It is basically inflation being pulled by the growing or increasing demand. Imagine a scenario where the demand for goods and services in an economy outstrips the available supply. What happens next? Prices start to rise. This phenomenon is known as demand pull inflation. It occurs when the aggregate demand, think of it as the total demand for all goods and services in the economy, exceeds aggregate supply. But how does demand pull inflation works? When aggregate demand exceeds aggregate supply, prices tend to rise because there are more consumers willing to buy goods and services than there are goods and services available. So here on the graph, we have two axes. The x-axis represents the real GDP or output, and the y-axis represents the price level. There are two key curves on this graph. The aggregate demand, or the AD. This curve shows the total demand for goods and services in the economy at different price levels. Next is the aggregate supply, or the AS. This curve shows the total supply of goods and services that firms in the economy are willing to produce at different price levels. So initially, the economy is at equilibrium where the AD curve intersects the AS curve. This point indicates the current price level and output. Now, let's say there's an increase in aggregate demand due to factors like increased consumer spending, higher government expenditure, or lower interest rates. This shifts the AD curve to the right from AD1 to AD2. So the new intersection of the AD2 curve with the AS curve serves in a higher price level and increased output. This rightward shift in demand causes demand pull inflation, where the higher demand pulls up prices. Now, why does this happen? There are several factors that can lead to demand pull inflation. First is the economic growth. When an economy grows rapidly, consumers and businesses have more income to spend, pushing up demand for goods and services. Second is government spending. Increased government expenditure, especially on large projects, can boost demand significantly. Third is rising exports. Rising exports can fuel demand pull inflation. When a country's exports increase, foreign buyers purchase more of its goods and services, boosting demand. As this demand rises, domestic producers may struggle to keep up, leading to higher prices. Additionally, increased export revenue can lead to more income for businesses and workers. This increased income can lead to higher spending within the economy, further boosting domestic demand for goods and services. More money chasing the same amount of goods and services typically results in higher prices, which is the essence of demand pull inflation. Fourth is the monetary policy. When central banks lower interest rates, borrowing becomes cheaper. This can lead to higher consumer spending and business investments, boosting demand. Lastly, is the consumer confidence. Consumer confidence plays a big role. When people feel good about their financial prospects and the economy's future, they're more likely to spend money. This increase in spending boosts demand for goods and services. Higher demand, if not matched by an increase in supply, drives prices up, leading to demand pull inflation. Essentially, the more confident consumers are, the more they spend, and the more prices can rise due to heightened demand. Optimism fuels the economy, but it can also ignite inflationary pressures. An important point to note is that while moderate inflation is a sign of a healthy, growing economy, excessive demand pull inflation can be problematic. It erodes purchasing power and can lead to a cycle of wage price spirals. Let's use a simple example to illustrate demand pull inflation. Picture a popular concert with a limited number of tickets. If the artist announces a one night only show, fans rush to buy tickets. The high demand causes ticket prices to soar. That's demand pull inflation in action. So, to summarize, demand pull inflation is essentially too much money chasing too few goods. It's driven by increased demand from consumers, businesses, and governments, often fueled by economic growth and monetary policies. What are the effects? First is higher prices. This is basically self explanatory as inflation means higher prices. Second is wage price spiral. A wage price spiral is when rising wages lead to higher costs for businesses, which then raise prices to cover these costs. This in turn can lead to higher inflation. As prices rise, workers demand higher wages to keep up with the increased cost of living, creating a cycle of wage and price increases. It's a tricky situation for an economy as it can sustain inflation over time if not managed properly. And lastly, interest rates. So the interest rates would then get higher or fluctuates. Here are some other examples of circumstances or situations that could lead to demand pull inflation. The post war economic booms after World War II, many economies experienced rapid growth and increased consumer spending, leading to demand pull inflation. Technology booms, periods of rapid technological advancement can lead to increased consumer and business spending on new technologies, driving up prices.
So, good day everyone. I'm Jasmine G. Lababit and I will be explaining cost push inflation using this diagram. So, what is cost push inflation? Cost push inflation occurs when prices rise due to increased production costs like wage and raw materials without any increase in demand for goods and services. This type of inflation is usually driven by supply side factors. So on the right side, we have the cost push inflation diagram. The y-axis represents the price level or PL and the y-axis represents real GDP or Y. The lines shown are the aggregate demand or AD curve and the short run aggregate supply or SRAS curves. First is initial equilibrium. The original equilibrium point is at the intersection of the AD curve and the initial SRAS curve labeled SRAS1. Here the economy is at price level P1 and output level Y1. Second is shift in SRAS. When there is an increase in production costs, the SRAS curve shifts leftward from SRAS1 to SRAS2. This shift indicates that supply of goods and services decreases because it is more expensive for producers to maintain the same output. And next is new equilibrium. As the SRAS shifts left, the new equilibrium is at a higher price level P2 and a lower output level Y2. This shows the prices have increased, but the quantity of goods and services produced has decreased. The gap between Y1 and Y2 highlights the decline in real GDP, which can negatively impact economic growth. So the cost push inflation means higher prices due to factors like increased cost of wage or raw materials. Even though demand hasn't changed, consumers end up paying more for goods and services. Consumer Price Index or CPI. The Consumer Price Index is a tool used to measure how the prices of goods and services that households typically buy change over time. It tells us how much more expensive or cheaper things are compared to a previous period known as the base year. According to the Encyclopedia of American Governments and Civics 2017, CPI measures the average change in prices paid by urban households for a market basket of goods and services. In simple terms, it tracks the prices of items like foods, clothing, and transportation and how much those prices have changed. Next is in the Philippines, the PSA Philippine Statistics Authority collects price data based on geographic regions. The cities usually require more data collections compared to provinces because there are more people and thus more goods and services being consumed. Next is the step to calculate CPI. First is collect price quotation for goods and services in the basket. Second is apply the data to the basket of goods over different time periods. So the formula is CPI equal to price of basket of goods and services in a year over price of basket of goods and services in the base year multiplied to 100. This formula helps us compare how much the total cost of the basket has changed from the base year to a particular year. So, for example, suppose we only have two products, mangoes and guyabanos. Hence, our basket of goods will be comprised of only mangoes and guyabanos. The PSA determines the weight for each product by surveying the consumption of these products. For example, the survey reveals that 6 mangoes and 4 guyabanos are bought in a period time. So let us go over the CPI and inflation computation list as follows. So in 2019, mangoes cost 11 pesos each and guyabanos 30 pesos each. In 2020, mangoes cost 13 pesos and guyabanos 35 pesos. In 2021, mangoes cost 15 pesos and guyabanos 42 pesos. So now let us compute the yearly basket of goods. In 2019, the total basket cost is 186 pesos and the total basket cost is 218 pesos. In 2021, the total basket cost is 258 pesos. Next is CPI results base year 2019. Using 2019 as the base year, CPI equal to 100. We can calculate the CPI for 2020 and 2021. In 2019, CPI is equal to 186 pesos over 186 pesos multiplied to 100 is equal to 100. In 2020, CPI is 218 pesos over 186 pesos multiplied to 100 equal is 117. In 2021, CPI 258 pesos over 186 pesos multiplied to 100 equal 139 pesos. Therefore, the inflation rates for 2020 and 2021 are as follows. The formula is inflation rate equal CPI in current year minus CPI in base year over CPI in base year multiplied to 100. So in 2019 is 0% because 2019 is our base year. And the 2020 inflation is 17% and the 2021 inflation is 19%. So the CPI helps us understand how much prices increase over time. This is important because rising prices or inflation affect our daily lives and the cost of living. For example, the prices of goods like mangoes and guavanos have increased significantly from 2019 to 2021, as shown by the inflation rates of 17% and 19%.
The monetary inflation. The monetary inflation refers to the expansion of a country's money supply. It is often driven by a central bank's policy actions, such as printing more currency or reducing interest rates. This increase in money supply can lead to higher demand for goods and services, causing the prices to rise, which is known as inflation. While a moderate level of inflation can stimulate economic growth, excessive inflation erodes purchasing power and can destabilize the economy. The relationship between the money supply and inflation is influenced by factors like economic output, public confidence, and global market conditions. So, the policymakers must carefully manage the money supply to maintain price stability and foster a sustainable economic growth. Now, we will proceed to the discussion of basket of goods and services. Let's have Rachel.
What are basket of goods and services? These are a variety of items that reflect typical consumer spending patterns. These items are selected to represent the consumption habits of households within a specific economy. There are categories included in the basket of goods and services, which are food and beverages, housing, apparel, transportation, medical care, recreation, education and communication, and other goods and services. But what exactly is a basket of goods? Imagine it as a collection of products and services that people commonly purchase, like groceries, clothing, housing, transportation, and healthcare. This basket represents the average consumer spending habits. Why is it important? Well, the basket of goods is crucial for measuring inflation. Economists and statisticians use it to track how prices change over time. When the cost of items in the basket rises, it indicates that the overall cost of living is going up, a phenomenon we call inflation. Let's break it down with an example. Suppose our basket includes essentials like bread, milk, gasoline, and rent. By comparing the total cost of this basket now to its cost a year ago, we can determine how much prices have increased. This helps calculate the Consumer Price Index or the CPI, a key indicator of inflation. Different countries might have different baskets of goods, reflecting variations in consumption patterns. For instance, in a country where public transportation is the norm, the basket might include train or bus fares, while in others, it might focus more on personal vehicles. But it's not just about tracking price changes. Policymakers use this data to make informed decisions. If inflation is too high, they might adjust interest rates or implement measures to stabilize prices.
Standard of living. The standard of living refers to how well people in society or country are doing in terms of income, access to services, and overall comfort. It's a way to measure the quality of life, but it's focused on the group as a whole rather than individuals. For example, a society with higher incomes, better healthcare, and more access to education is considered to have a higher standard of living. This directly affects how happy or satisfied people are in their daily lives.
Now let's have the economic crashes. Economic crashes usually begin with rising prices and the expectation of further inflation, which triggers increased consumer demand and spending. As prices continue to rise, personal wealth and savings are eroded, limiting purchasing power and confidence. This leads to reduced foreign investment and trade, while governments may print more money to ease the pressure, exacerbating inflation. The rapid increase in money supply and faster velocity of money further fuels inflation, creating a vicious cycle that can destabilize the economy and lead to a crash. Let's have Rachel to discuss the cost of living allowance or the COLA.
The cost of living allowance or COLA. It is an additional payment made to employees to help offset the impact of inflation on their essential living expenses. This is to ensure that employees maintain their purchasing power despite rising costs of living. It helps employees cope with inflation, which erodes the value of money over time. COLA should match the inflation rate determined by the CPI. For example, if an employee earns $50,000 annually and the COLA for the year is 3%, their salary would increase by $1,500 to $51,500 to help offset the increased cost of living. A cost of living allowance or COLA is an adjustment made to salaries based on changes in a cost of living index. This helps ensure that employees' purchasing power remains consistent even as prices for goods and services fluctuate. It's particularly important in areas where the cost of living is high or subject to rapid change. COLAs are typically calculated based on inflation rates, which are determined by tracking the cost of a standard set of goods and services over time. These allowances can be part of wages for certain jobs, pensions, or social security benefits. So, for example, if you live in a city where rent, groceries, and utilities suddenly become more expensive, a COLA can help cushion the financial impact of adjusting your salary upward. It's a way for employers and governments to help people maintain a consistent standard of living despite economic changes. It's like a financial buffer against the unpredictable nature of the economy.
Next is Big Mac Index. The Big Mac Index is an interesting and simple way to measure differences in purchasing power between countries instead of using a traditional basket goods. To compare prices, economists use the price of a Big Mac, which is globally recognized product.
There are two methods used to analyze the income percentage in relation to the percentage of population. One is the Lawrence curve introduced by American economist Max Lawrence in 1905. The Lawrence curve is an important tool used to represent income or wealth distribution within a population. So on the graph, we have two main axes. The x-axis represents the cumulative percentage of the population sorted from the poorest to the richest. The y-axis represents the cumulative percentage of income or wealth. This curve shows the actual distribution of income or wealth in the population. It typically bows below the line of equality, illustrating the inequality in income distribution. So the more the Lorentz curve bows away from the line of equality, the greater the level of income inequality. So, for example, if the Lorentz curve is significantly below the line of equality, it means a larger proportion of total income is concentrated in the hands of a smaller percentage of the population. In Gini coefficient, the Lorentz curve is also used to calculate the Gini coefficient, a measure of income inequality. The Gini coefficient ranges from 0 to 1. So, Gini coefficient of 0 indicates perfect equality, while Gini coefficient of 1 indicates perfect inequality. The area between the line of equality and the Lorentz curve represents the degree of inequality. The larger this area, the higher the Gini coefficient and the greater the income inequality. And that summarizes our report. This is Rachel Bustamante together with Miss Arjen Antonio and Miss Jasmine Lababi. Thank you.